Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, January 15th, and we are going to be starting our conversations with different agencies and stakeholders regarding housing production. Will kind of be the theme of our conversations this morning. And we first are going to welcome Frank Knack, who is the Executive Director of Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. And I think there are definitely a lot of new faces in this committee. So if we just want to go around and introduce ourselves, I think that would be very helpful.
All right, Emily Krasnow, South Burlington, Chittenden 9.
Frank,
Hi,
I'm Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor One, Rutland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
Good morning, I'm Mary Howard and I represent Rutland City, District 6. I'm Debbie Dolkin, I represent St. Johnsbury, Concord, and Kirby.
Tom Charlton, Athens, Chester, Grafton, and Wyndham. Joe Parsons, Orange Caledonia District.
Leonora Dodge, Essex Town, City of Essex Junction.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax, and Georgia.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for the opportunity to testify. I'm going to hand out a copy of our materials.
Could you send an electronic copy of this?
Yes,
to the Valley?
definitely.
Thank you.
Apologize for not finding it before. So just to give a little background on who we are at HHAV. So HHAV came together about a year and a half ago, and as a result of a merger between two longstanding Vermont housing and homelessness organizations, the Vermont Coalition on Homelessness and the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition, who have both been working in Vermont for many, many years. Obviously on similar issues, with the kind of ultimate goal being production of permanent affordable housing, but with different strategies. And so a year and a half ago, the boards came together and said, hey, you know, the ultimate solution to homelessness is affordable housing. We should come together and merge. And so we became HHAV at that point. And so we work in a couple of different ways at HHAV. We work in advocacy like today, where we talk with legislators, educate folks about housing and homelessness related issues. We work in communities to educate community members as well. And we also, with our second hat, are the collaborative applicant for the balance of state continuum of care. And so what that is each state has one or more continuum of care, which are HUD designated homelessness response systems. And so in Vermont, we have two COCs. We have the balance of state, which is every county minus Chittenden, so the balance of Vermont, and then the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance. And so we at HHAV are the collaborative applicants, so help staff the balance of state COC. And so work with frontline homelessness response providers across the state in every county minus Chittenden, and then coordinate closely with the Chittenden County Homeless Alliance. And so today I'm going to talk about our legislative priorities for this legislative session. And just to give you a little context about how these priorities came together. So we are a membership organization. Our members include folks from the affordable housing space, from the services space, from the shelter and services space, and had worked with our partners and members over the past 6 months to come up with this agenda. So understanding like what are the problems in Vermont and what are the solutions. And as you'll see from this document, a lot of the solutions really revolve around additional funding to kind of build the infrastructure and supports. And so kind of I'll walk you through that continuum. And so starting backwards, because I think that may make the most sense in this, running through the continuum. And so there's kind of three global buckets that we're working within. The first is kind of homelessness response, and so emergency shelter. The second is kind of the services and homelessness response things to keep people housed who are at risk of homelessness. And then the third bucket is the ultimate solution, which is permanent affordable housing. And starting with the kind of problem, I'll just give you all a little context about where we're at in Vermont right now. So in Vermont, every year, Vermont participates in what's called the point in time count, which is every year across the United States on the same night, there's a count done by the continuum of care across the country around the number of people who are unhoused on that specific night. So we have one common metric across the country to understand homelessness. And so,
Sorry. Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
What day is that?
I think it was January 20th.
Is it always in the
It's
winter?
always in January.
Okay.
It has been in January the last couple of years. I don't know beyond that, yes.
Thank you.
I think it was right around January 25th last year. And so partners that we work with through the Continuum of Care and Chittenden County Homeless Alliance went out across Vermont and worked with the folks they serve to kind of understand the number of people who are unhoused in Vermont. We know from a number of sources that that is an undercount because someone counting the number of people who are overstretched and under-resourced homelessness response providers can reach. But even looking at that undercount, we were at 3,500. So a record number in Vermont of unhoused people were counted last year as part of the PIC count. And to put that in context nationally, HUD just released the 2024 PIC count report. We had the fourth highest per capita rate of homelessness in the entire country. Last year, we had the second highest rate. And this year, some of the differences were Hawaii moved up because of the fires in Hawaii, or because of the fires in Hawaii. And New York moved up because of some factors, particularly in New York City. But our rate also increased. And so we are going in a bad direction in Vermont right now in terms of homelessness response. So we have 3,500 people accounted in the PIC count last year. And our emergency response system, so our shelter system in Vermont, has a maximum currently of 585 beds. And so put those two numbers together, 3,500 unhoused people, 535 shelter beds or households. So it's a little bit more, huge gap. And so how have we made up for that gap? In recent years, that's really been through the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program, which is commonly referred to as the hotel motel program. That's really served as the backstop, particularly for the most vulnerable for Vermonters. And so as the legislature the last couple of years have kind of clarified who qualifies for the hotel motel program are people who you all have deemed to be the most vulnerable. So we're talking about seniors, families with children, people with disabilities, people fleeing domestic violence, people who have some type of emergency like their house burned down. Those are the folks who qualify. And so at the GA level right now, we're housing about 1,175 households. And so 585 shelter beds, 1,175 households, 3,500 people. So we're still having a huge gap. But that GA program is key to kind of reducing that gap. And so from our perspective, I think one of the key things we're asking for this legislative session is for the legislature to continue the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program, but in a way that removes some of the hurdles that were created last session. And so if we recall last session, there were a few changes to the GA program. The first of which was they created caps. And so previously, if you were deemed eligible, so if you met the vulnerable criteria, you were able to access the program without any type of caps. Last year, they placed caps in place. So beginning in September of this year, there were caps in terms of the number of nights that vulnerable people were eligible to use the GA program. So 80 nights you were eligible. And then the max number of hotel rooms that would be available under the program, which was capped at 1,100. And so what happened, if you recall back in September, when those caps went into place, the state of Vermont began exiting hundreds and hundreds of people the state had deemed as vulnerable. So again, seniors, people with children, people fleeing domestic violence, et cetera. And so I think from our perspective, it's really, really important that we remove those caps because those folks were exited into a homelessness response system that was already stretched beyond capacity. There was no place for people to go. And so we literally had families with children being given tents and saying, good luck. That's what we were doing in Vermont. And so I think from our perspective, those caps need to go. As we build up the response system, we can talk about kind of tiering that out, maybe moving back to restrictions. But right now we have no place for people to go. The second part of the GA program that we were concerned with last year was the way that we handled the winter weather program. And so previously we had what's called adverse weather. And so even if you didn't qualify under GA for the criteria, everyone in Vermont, if you were unhoused in the winter, was eligible for GA because we all know Vermont, you cannot survive outside in a tent in the winter for the entire winter. It's just not possible. And so what happened last year during the legislative session was they placed restrictions on that program. So previously, all Vermonters were eligible if you were unhoused. What happened last year was they created restrictions, so only people who were vulnerable were eligible for the GA program. And so currently, unless you meet one of those criteria for vulnerable, you are not eligible for the hotel motel program, and we have no shelter capacity. And so people are left living outside in Vermont in the winter. So we think it's really important that those caps be lifted. And oh, sorry,
I
Representative.
just wanted to, I wanted to add to that. I absolutely agree. Right now, there's estimated in Chittenden County, a few hundred people who are out right now, in the cold. And my biggest concern too is that the state's, trigger temperatures are pretty rigid. And so next week, for example, is going to be extremely cold. And so I'm currently working with the city of South Burlington and our council to try to see if we can replicate what Burlington is doing, but it's put a tremendous amount of stress and pressures on our municipalities because of I feel like failures on the state. And so, they are left, if the municipality doesn't have the budget for such things, we're trying to figure out if South Burlington obviously is a large municipality and we have some money for it, but it's still the staffing issues are, hundreds of dollars an hour. They have to pay people to be there. So it's been, I just want to emphasize how hard it has been when it's even temperatures. I mean, even right now is so cold to be outside. And so when the state's temperature triggers are negatives, it's really hard for me to feel like that's okay. So municipalities have really had to step up, and I just want to emphasize the strain that's caused our communities in Chittenden County. We're dealing with it every day, and it's just been so hard.
Yeah, and I think strain both in terms of at the individual level of staffing, but also the kind of unfunded mandate that it's put on municipalities in terms of first responders, law enforcement, et cetera, having to respond in a much less efficient way to the crisis. And all those are part of the GA Emergency Housing Task Force recommendations that should be submitted to the legislature today. So we at HHAB were a member of the GA Emergency Housing Task Force. It was representative of 13 folks from across the kind of homelessness housing response system who came up with those recommendations. And so we strongly support those recommendations for this legislative cycle. So kind of moving along the continuum, the next piece is, so we have a crisis, we lack capacity. The next phase is really about not making the crisis work and worse. And that is about kind of the homelessness response kind of system we have right now to kind of keep people who are at risk of homelessness from becoming unhoused. And so that is really through kind of services and supports, a lot of which is through the HOP program that's administered through OEO. And also what was called the ERAP program, which were some federal funds. And just to give you a sense of kind of how regionally diverse these funding are, it hits everywhere in Vermont. So Addison, Bennington, Brattleboro, Caledonia, Essex, Chittenden, Franklin Grand Isle, Lamoille, Rutland, Springfield, Upper Valley, Washington County. And so all those jurisdictions are receiving HOP funds that are used in, I'm sorry.
Is there still a VRAP program? Is there still funds?
For HOP or?
VRAP,
No, it's gone.
Yeah.
it's gone,
yeah.
okay.
And so the HOP fund, what we're really asking for this year in terms of the budget amount is really just a continuation of the status quo with a COLA increase. So we're not asking for more, but we need to make sure that we are funding the programs and services that are currently on the ground across Vermont that are keeping more people from becoming unhoused. And at the same time, there was a separate program called ERAP, which were federal funds that were on the ground in Vermont. And so those funds are in jurisdictions including Burlington, Barry, Morrisville, St. Albans, Middlebury, Burlington, Rutland, Bennington, Brattleboro, Springfield, Hartford. And those are also funding similar kind of homelessness response.
Yeah, sorry, can we,
Oh,
if you're talking about a different section.
Sorry, I apologize. Yeah.
Would you mind just moving us to that so that I think people that
Yeah.
following along online also would really like
Apologize.
to know what you're.
Yes.
Planning to, thank you.
And so here I'm talking about the first few bullets here, which are the HOP program funds and the ERAP funds, which we think are really vital that the state continue to support. Because without that, that 3,500 number is just going to increase. We're also looking at very few expansion opportunities, but where we are looking at expansion opportunities, we think it's really vital that the state support these. And so some of which, and I know Molly Dugan's here to talk more about this, but is expansion of SASH, which is kind of place-based support services for the communities that they serve that have, you know, evidence-based programs that have kept people in their homes and from going into homelessness. And also Pathways, which is site-based, so where they go out and they serve folks in communities. Expansion of Pathways in the Rutland County, where we see a real need for that type of service. And so I don't know how much time I have, how much in the weeds I should get, if I should move quickly.
30 minutes.
30 minutes, okay, so about 15 minutes, okay, thanks. And so as we move through this, we're also looking, again, this is all really about maintaining status quo. And so kind of ensuring that we continue to have the eviction prevention, the rental assistance programs that we funded, that we continue to fund voucher programs that kind of keep people in their homes and ensure people are not exiting into homelessness. So again, this whole section is really about keeping people from moving into homelessness that are at risk of homelessness. And then this last bullet, I should note, or the second last bullet, the 3.5 million to maintain trained resident services coordinators. And so I think we're really fortunate in Vermont to have an amazing kind of housing trust system that are providing kind of permanently affordable housing to thousands and thousands of people across the state. Because we have not, as a state, invested in the supports to the level that they should be. A lot of the housing trusts have had to dig into their own budgets to kind of provide housing support navigators, et cetera, in their communities. And what that does is takes away from their ability to do other really important things. And so we think the state should really start stepping up and supporting that more going forward. So we're asking also for an additional 3.5 million to kind of help offset those budget impacts that housing trusts are having right now, in terms of having to go into their own pockets to hire those key staff to keep people housed in their communities. And then moving to what we really see as kind of the solution to homelessness, which is permanently affordable housing. And so the kind of two key areas here around funding for BHCB and BHFA, I think Gus is going to be in this committee later today and can kind of get into the weeds on some of the BHCB, and Chad, I know y'all will be talking about BHFA. But we really see those as kind of the core partners that really need support to kind of be able to continue the kind of flow of permanently affordable housing, that Vermont continue that flow. We've had thousands of units come online over the last couple of years because the state has recognized the importance of investing in permanently affordable housing, but we still need thousands more. And so it's really important that we continue to maximize the pipeline of investment. And so it's funding BHCB. We're asking for 80 million of funding for BHCB in addition to their statutory property transfer tax share. And we're asking for those funds to be set up in a way where it really gives BHCB maximum flexibility. And so there's multiple ways that BHCB engages with those funds to kind of build housing, to kind of ensure shelter capacity. But if we give it to BHCB in a way where they kind of have the ability to kind of maximize dollars and not have tied to a specific program, that gives them the ability to kind of get things up and running faster and more efficiently. And the same with BHFA's ask of, I believe it's 36 million. So BHFA does a number of really important programs: the Middle Income Homeownership Development Program, First Gen Homeownership Rental Revolving Loan Fund. But again, we're asking for those funds to be given to BHFA in a way where they have the flexibility to spend those where they see maximum output. And so I know they'll both be here to kind of talk more in the weeds about the types of things that they can do with those. In addition, you know, the mobile home parks and the kind of mobile home communities are really key to kind of solving the homelessness crisis in Vermont. And so we have a number of asks around kind of really maximizing our capacity around mobile homes, so rapid response mobile home program, healthy homes, et cetera. And then I think finally, I don't want to kind of ignore some of the other really important things that we think need to be funded. So the Land Access and Opportunity Board, which has really been charged with kind of ensuring that we have equity within the kind of housing development, homelessness response system. We see a really key partner in our work. You know, Vermont has one of the worst racial disparities and homelessness in the entire country. So that's something that we need to recognize and solve. And so Land Access and Opportunity Board has been a key partner, not only in that, but ensuring we have equity across the board in our housing and then also farm worker housing. So we have a huge shortage in farm worker housing in Vermont that impacts farmers, that impacts their employees. From an economic development perspective, it's something that's key. So we really support continuing the funding, which goes to Champlain Housing Trust for housing. And so happy to answer any questions y'all may have and can also get back to y'all with kind of drill down pieces of any of this going forward.
Thank you for your presentation. I totally agree with everything you're saying. I I don't like that Vermont is number one in a couple areas, and I do think that the administration could do more. Why do you suppose Rutland, not Rutland, although Rutland is has had some issues, why is Vermont the number one state in the country for homelessness? Why do you, what attributes?
Yeah, we're not number one, but we're close. We're number 4 in terms of, per capita. I think there's a lot of reasons for the housing crisis in Vermont. We have not built to the level that we need. So VHFA has done a housing analysis in terms of how many homes we need. I think it was 26,000 to 30,000 over the next 5 years. So we have a huge gap in the number of homes available. And within that, we have a huge gap in which are permanently affordable housing. We see a rising increase between the cost of housing and wages in Vermont. Post-COVID, more people moving into our state, which is obviously, shrunk the kind of availability. We have, short-term rentals. So which is not a global problem, but particularly in ski towns like Ludlow or Stowe, that you have I think 50+%, which short-term rentals or seasonal rentals. So there's kind of myriad factors that have created the crisis. But I think from our perspective, to ultimately solve the crisis, we need to invest in permanently affordable housing. So there's also, regulatory things that we could do. Like we support, right now, one of the big issues on the regulatory side is the ability on the appeals process for one or a few individuals to basically hang up a development project for years on end, which ends up massively driving up the cost. And so we really support capping the length of time on appeals. So say 6 months, you can appeal a project, but you can't drag it out for years. And so I think there's a whole host of things that have created the crisis. But, I think one of the things that I would urge the legislature to do is to kind of think about regulatory reform is important, but it's not the ultimate solution. We need funding and to also make that kind of long-term investment. And so oftentimes throughout this, there's one-time funding here, one-time funding there, particularly on the development side, it's how do you commit to a long-term project if you have never have clear consistency of understanding where your funds are and what the funds are going to be. On the homelessness response side, how do you manage a staff when so many of the staff are funded by one-time positions and don't have that job security and don't feel, and so you can't kind of manage year to year, and so you're always kind of triaging. And I think kind of really ensuring that we are having that long-term vision, investing in that long-term vision is really important.
I mean, we had a housing problem before COVID to start with, so it's just.
Yeah, so it's definitely gotten, COVID just magnified the crisis.
Worse.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm gonna go.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
No, it's okay. I'm gonna go to Rep Burrows, then Rep Parsons, and then we'll go to you, Rep Pazell.
Do you have any kind of scatter map of outside of Chittenden County where I just wondered whether there was a pattern of higher rates of homelessness in different areas of our state? Do you have a map like that?
We have, so I could send the point in time count, which the Vermont point in time count that we released last, I think it was May or June, has an appendix which goes through by county what the homelessness numbers look like. And then I could also pull more recent coordinated entry, which is like our homelessness response kind of database, and provide that to the committee. for
I'd
each
love to see that,
section.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Me
can
too.
definitely do that.
Great. I just don't have a sense of where, I mean, obviously Washington County we're familiar with because we're here, but I don't really have a sense of exactly where in the other counties homeless people are located.
So in terms of this physical location where folks are at.
Yeah. What
that-
towns and?
Oh, we can definitely do that. Like within a town,
Yeah.
some folks are in shelters or in hotels, some are living, in parks. And so we may not know the folks who are unsheltered homeless at this point exactly where they are. But we can give you the numbers to the best of our ability through coordinated entry.
So for example, in my area, there's no homeless shelter or overnight warm, shelter. There's no emergency program. So it, I think would be pretty hard to count on the point in time count where people actually are. And I wondered, how do you account for that? It's got to be a pretty big population as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that we know that PIT count is an undercount.
Yeah.
So we can still count, so it's easiest obviously to count the folks who are in the shelter who are in the GA program
Right.
because they're in a physical place. But our homelessness response providers across the state have built trusted relationships with folks who are unsheltered homeless. And so kind of know where folks are and can kind of get out and engage with them and try and connect them with services. Like we don't have the services we need, but can connect them to the extent that we can with services. So they've built relationships. They know where some folks are and can kind of get to those folks, but there's a limit to that because of capacity. And so we know partly where folks are who are unsheltered homeless, but not everywhere. So our coordinated entry numbers should reflect some, but not all.
Okay, so for example, the church that opens up next week and is run through volunteers, does that somehow make it into your numbers?
So as long as they were referred to the system, and I can't speak on fact specific on this specific issue, but in general, when temporary shelters are stood up, they're connected with the homelessness, the local housing coalition, which is the kind of lead agent. There's a local lead agency within the local housing coalition that oversees coordinated entry for that jurisdiction. And so they'll get connected in with the system,
Okay, thank you.
definitely.
Parson.
Thank you. I was just looking at the pit count across the country and I was just not finding it. So maybe, do you happen to know what 1, 2, like we're 4, you said?
We're number 4 for per capita.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what Matt is. Yeah. Do you know what 1, 2? I was just trying to find.
New York, Hawaii, and Oregon, I think, are above us.
Thanks.
So,
Reza.
I'm up already. Do you happen to know the percentage out of state that come to Vermont that are homeless?
so I know that number has been sought in a number of different ways. There was actually a Digger, I could send you the Digger article that was on this. I think it was well under 5%. I
Yeah.
forget the specific percentage. It was a very, very small percent of folks. And there was 2 different kind of data sets that they cited in that story, in the
Okay.
Digger story. But there's no, we don't have any way of kind of collecting that. The state had done some research a while back, a couple years ago, and then I think another organization had done some research on that, but
Okay.
both had basically the same number, and it was, I forget off the top of my head, but it was under 5%.
Sorry, we're gonna do Rep Dodge and then you'll be our last question.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak to how efficiently the funds actually get out with all of these massive, like, there are so many organizations involved and avenues for investment and then just direct service. And so, do you have any key asks for method, like effectiveness?
So I think, particularly on, BHCB and BHFA can talk about some of their processes for getting the funds out. I know in terms of the HOP and the ERAP side, which goes through OEO, OEO is extremely efficient at kind of getting the dollars out. So kind of getting the proposals, they coordinate closely with the two continuum of care in Vermont. There are kind of processes through the continuum of care to identify projects. So we have a fairly efficient process. I think part of the problem, though, is a lot of times those are one-time funds. And so it's like figuring out how that you can spend the one-time funds can become difficult if we're talking about staffing, because, when you're staffing at one position, it's harder to hire than if it's a permanent position. And oftentimes too, the rates of pay are, very low. Like, we have a living wage problem even within the service provider community. Because the cost of living in Vermont has gone so high. And so we're talking about really, really difficult work. And so I think, in a perfect world, we would see drastic increases in terms of the funds that are going into the service providers so that they can pay higher, more competitive wages. We're just in a really tight fiscal environment right now around that.
Just like as a follow-up, for instance, I know that there were people who were, I hope that's housing being built. The like emergency family housing vouchers, like, I'm in CVOEO land, and there was a family that was about, imminently about to be homeless, and they were given a voucher and they never found an apartment to use it in. And so like, are there any spots where you're seeing that money is available and can't get spent?
Oh, absolutely. So on the
Okay,
voucher
thank you.
side in particular, but the problem is because we don't have units available to move people into. And so like with Section 8 vouchers, for example, there's a set time that you can have that, and we're having to give back vouchers
Yeah.
because there's no place for people to move into. So that's why I think from our perspective, all three of these buckets are so important, and why we need to adequately fund BHCB, why we need to adequately fund BHFA, so we can build the solutions so that we're not giving back vouchers because we don't have units.
Thank you.
Going back to the question, Representative Pitzo asked about this 5% influx. This is really salient data for our constituents. And I think there's a conception among a lot of constituents that, of course, we have a lot of homeless people in the state because we're giving them hotel rooms. This is what I hear. But being able to answer that cogently and help our constituents understand that 95% of the people we're looking at are Vermont residents whose situations have just crashed.
Yes.
And it shouldn't be the case, but I think that will generate more support among constituents, especially the ones who are sparkling under their taxes.
Yeah.
To know that they are in fact helping their neighbors.
Yes, exactly. And so I will circulate that Digger
Anything
story
we've got all.
to y'all. They did a pretty in-depth piece. I think they included like a 30-minute podcast along with it. It kind of went into that rhetoric and then how it's, what the data actually shows. And I think one of the really interesting things in that was they were interviewing an expert from Washington State, a professor from, I think, Washington State. And he's like, I work in a bunch of states on these issues. I hear that argument being brought up in every state. And so how is it possible that in every state people are coming in from other states to take advantage of their great services? And so I think it's just a talking point that's really gotten pushed, but the evidence in Vermont or in other states doesn't back it up. But yeah, I'll get that Digger out to y'all.
Okay, and any future opportunity to gather data.
Oh, that is on our list to figure out how we can gather 100%.
Well, thank you so much, Frank. If you could get that information to Magali, that'd be really helpful. I think there are a few more questions that Rep. Howard had, but I think we do need to move on. So if maybe you two want to connect offline,
Yes.
that'd be great.
Mine isn't exactly a question. It is my understanding that when COVID first hit, that the federal government gave vouchers to people and they could be used in any state, not just, they could come here from anywhere and be accepted.
Could you provide us by email more information on the issue that Rep. Howard just raised?
Thank you.
Definitely, we'll do.
Thank you.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming in. And I guess we will move on to our next.
Sarah Mira.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sarah, were you in the room when the committee introduced itself?
No, but I.
Well, we'll introduce ourselves. Have a seat. So this is Sarah Miroff. So why don't you start and let's go around and introduce ourselves there.
Hi, Sarah. Ashley Bartley, and I represent Fairfax in Georgia.
Leonora Dodge, I represent Essex Town in the city of Essex Junction.
Joe Parsons, Newberry, Thompson, and Groton.
I'm Charlton, Athens, Chester, Grafton, and Winter.
Debbie Dolgan for St. Johnsbury, Kirby, and Concord.
Gail Pezzo, Chittenden 20, Colchester.
Mary Howard, Rutland City District 6.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burrows and I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
Emily Krosnow, South Burlington, Chittenden 9.
And I'm Mark Mahaly. I represent Callis, Plainfield, and Marshfield. Welcome. Please state your name for the record
Thank you.
and welcome to your role.
Thank you. I appreciate it. May I move my chair down a little bit? My feet are dangling. Okay, that's
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, right? Feels a lot better.
Normal size.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Sarah Meerhoff. I am the new Director of Advocacy and Communications for the Associated General Contractors of Vermont, which for all of our sakes, I will probably abbreviate to AGC Vermont from here on out. We are under the umbrella of the National Associated General Contractors of America. And in Vermont, we have existed for roughly 90 years. And we represent 224 members throughout the entirety of the state. So our members are builders, contractors, timber framers, pavers, you name it. If folks are building it in Vermont, it's more than likely that they are one of our members. So
Sarah, let me just ask a quick question. Do you have any sense as to what percentage of all the contractors who are active are members of AGC?
I'm not positive, but I can get you the number.
Okay,
I'll circle back with it.
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of our interest in, our platform and how it intersects with your committee, it's probably fairly obvious. Housing. I think it's top of mind for everybody in the state of Vermont right now. And I would say that our members' interest in this topic is not just, it's obvious that they have an interest in it because they're building it, of course. But also I would emphasize for you all that our members are also employers in of themselves. And I have already heard from many members that, like all employers that you hear from, I'm sure, they want to hire folks and they have a hard time even retaining and hiring folks because they can't find a place to live. Tale as old as time, right? I'm just looking at notes here. So in addition to the fact that our members are building the housing and are employers in of themselves, our members also really care because they're Vermonters in of themselves. I was just on a call with our members talking about the 2025 legislative session. And one of our members said that they, of course, want to build more housing and businesses in Vermont, but they also don't want to see Vermont become New Jersey. No offense to New Jersey, but our members really do care about maintaining the Vermont that we all know and love. I think all of us at this table can agree on that. So in terms of what we are hoping to see accomplished this legislative session, I would kind of break it down into 3 pots, and 2 of them really go hand in hand. Bless you. The first and foremost, permitting and appeals reform. And I'll go more in depth on each of these in a second here. The second, and I think these really have to go in tangent, is money to help make the dollars and cents of all of this add up and work. And then third, and it's very difficult to legislate, I will say, upfront is a culture change. So first, I'll get into probably the weediest and the almost third rail of the topics, permitting and appeals. I'm certainly not the first person to sit before you all and tell you that the permitting and appeals process in Vermont can be long and arduous and expensive and unpredictable, and it makes it really difficult for our members to be able to accomplish their jobs in a timely and predictable fashion. I heard from our members that the Home Act last year was a great start to this conversation, and that particularly the loosening of some of our Act 250 restrictions in the downtown and dense village town centers was great, but it's of course geographically, proportionally, relatively restricted, right, to just a section of Vermont. So first and foremost, for our members, I mean, for folks who are doing business outside of those downtown village and town centers, kind of cuts them out from those opportunities. They're not able to take advantage of that, several years long period where these restrictions are alleviated. Also, just Vermonters and of themselves, and I say this as a city girl, I live in Barrie, not everyone wants to live in a city. And so in terms of building new housing, that not everybody wants to live in a downtown dense area. And then just in terms of the map and, Vermont is a small state, and within that, it's an even smaller portion of the state that is a dense area. I'll take my city of Barrie as an example. Barrie is relatively confined. It's a small geographic area, and it's also geographically and topographically challenged, right? And so our downtown is small. And then, of course, we were just ravaged by the 2023 and 2024 floods. So we're super limited in where we can build within downtown Barrie. So if you expound that upon, the entirety of the state, it just kind of snowballs. Also, in terms of the permitting and appeal process, I alluded to this already, but it costs time and resources. That time and resources just ends up being fed back into the just outrageous cost, really, to build a single unit of housing in the state. And then the time and the unpredictability of it. I mean, we are at a point where our members are having to plan so far out in advance for projects. And so if there are hiccups along the way, it makes it really difficult to plan for a season, to recruit your workers, to help find housing for your workers. You can see how this all kind of intersects with each other. I was thinking about it this morning as I was making my breakfast. It's kind of like a terrarium, like one of those self-containing ecosystems, and it all just feeds into each other, right? So that's the permitting piece of that. And I think that, again, the Home Act was a really great first step in that. And I certainly understand the environmental concerns and, motivations for the reason to contain development to dense areas. I think we all really care, especially after what we've seen for the past 2 summers right in a row. Environmental concerns, we're all really sensitive to that. I think that we can do things in a smart way and still in an environmentally conscious way to think bigger than just downtown. Second piece, funding. I thought it was great. The presentation that you heard from Angie yesterday at Down Street was so prescient. She really got into the weeds of how expensive it is to build and how even when you can leverage private and public dollars, it is still so cost prohibitive. That example that she gave of the project in Barrie, and I promise I don't always talk about Barrie, sorry, was so relevant because she said DEW, that's actually one of our members, large, very successful, obviously for-profit developer, they simply couldn't make it work without some kind of subsidy. And I'm very concerned about that being just further exacerbated, particularly at a time when, we may be seeing tariffs coming to pass in the not too far future, although it's still, I think, too early to say how that might affect Vermont. But the cost of construction, materials and labor is just out of this world. I think the first time I heard the number that it cost, $500,000 to build a single unit of housing, my eyes just popped out of my head, right?
Sarah, could I ask you,
Please.
Have you been, is there any, have your members seen a lightening on the cost of construction? That is, have some materials come down since COVID?
Yes and no, because it's so, from what I've heard, because it's so in flux. And also because of supply chain issues are still so unpredictable. I heard from some members the other day that getting electrical panels, it's like a year-long wait or something just to get an electrical panel. And so I think that there has been some like leavening in that situation, but also it's still just logistically really complicated.
We have a question here.
Yeah.
I interrupt your flow.
Oh, no, please.
And I guess on the other side of that, of the supplies is obviously the labor. And so I'm sure some of your members are like big contractors that hire them, that themselves are hiring a lot of workers. And I'm really interested in if you could tell us anything about the growing proportion of immigrant workers in the ranks of our housing builders.
I'd have to get back to you on any growing proportion of new American workers. What I will say, just very broadly speaking, is that I know that AGC is really supportive of efforts for safe and legal immigration to allow opportunities for new Americans to participate in the workforce, for sure.
Well, we're going to be waiting a long time for legal immigration reform. So
It's a little above my pay grade, to be.
Yeah, all right. Well, I guess I would just say, I think like, at least I know that there are several legislators that are interested in trying to find out like how we can help in any way with removing obstacles, because we are dependent on that population. That's the only growing population that's actually going to build our homes.
Yeah.
So I just encourage, our witnesses to just keep that in mind as well.
Great.
And to,
Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman,
We have another question.
please.
Yeah, Rev,
Krasna, what would
yes.
you like?
Rev Dodge touched on part of my question, but I'm curious to know about if you have any data to share about I meet with developers and contractors all the time, and it's my understanding, I'd like to know about the influx of out-of-state workers being hired and the data on that. And I have concerns, as Rev Dodge stated as well, and also about recently in the news, some of the conditions that folks are forced into by their employer has raised some flags for me. And I'd like to know more about that and your organization's response to some of that, and making sure that, mom and pop contractors are not undercut by large companies.
In terms of that data, I'll get back to you. I don't have that right in front of me. I can say just broadly speaking that I think that Vermont is making really good investments in technical education and workforce training and things like that, so that we can hire and retain from within the state. I do think there could be more work done. It's probably an issue for another committee. There's more work to be done, surely, to keep folks in the state and developing a pipeline for folks in the trades within the state. I hear you on the housing conditions question, and I will also get back to you on that because I don't have information right in front of me on that.
I think that's, an issue that's going to surface here. We don't want to overly burden contractors. We don't want to make life more difficult for small contractors as opposed to large contractors. And every time in any field that we regulate, there is a tendency for our regulation to backfire, in that it works for the large entities and doesn't work for the small entities. Nonetheless, we don't want people to be poorly housed and poorly treated.
Right.
Who are working. And so that's going to be a balancing act. And I think you guys should play a role in helping us think that through.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure, because none of us want to see, especially like you said, mom and pop houses, just completely tied up in regulatory burdens. Hold on, let me just find my place.
You were in funding,
Yes.
but not yet in culture, which I'm very interested in hearing.
Yes, and so Angie had alluded to yesterday the cost, particularly of connecting new builds with municipal infrastructure is a particularly high burden. And I would just say on the cost front, I mean, I know that we are not, as a state, flush with the cash that maybe we saw a couple of years ago, thanks to the feds. But I think we can all recognize that housing seems to be the root of so many Vermont issues, and so many things feed into it. And so I think investments in housing really does benefit the whole of the state, is the kind of plug I would put there. And our members really don't want to only build $500,000 houses that only the wealthy among us can afford. Our members are Vermonters themselves, and they want to see safe, affordable, and workforce housing being built, and they want to have a hand in that. They also have to, they have a bottom line too, and they need to make sure that they're sustaining themselves as well. So at this point in time, because of the extremely high cost of construction, it seems that some public input is really necessary in order to make those dollars and cents work. And I would say that first point on permitting and appeals and the second point on funding is really so tied together, because neither will work without the other. I mean, you can throw as much money at the issue as you want, but if it takes 6 years to get a project, even groundbreaking on it, then we're really not making a meaningful dent in the issue. And vice versa too, of course. If there isn't the money, but there are permitting reforms, then we're just going to be kind of treading water, right? And then the last point on culture change. And I know that you can't legislate culture, that's for sure. But one thing that I heard so loudly from my members when I had that call with them last week was that they are seeing, when they are working on projects and going through, trying to get proposals and community buy-in, it is still so difficult for them to get that community buy-in. There's a lot of NIMBYism, not in my backyard-ism. I don't know how we take a crack at that really within this building. I mean, maybe it's how we come to the table ourselves and talk to one another. Maybe there are some legislative initiatives, but that certainly seems to be an issue still for folks who really just want the best for the state and want safe, affordable housing for everyone and want to have a hand in building it.
Please, Rep. Burrow.
Is it really NIMBYism though? Or is it a strain of xenophobia?
Maybe a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, really, is how I would respond to that. Yeah, there's a little bit of both. I mean, I came from out of state, right? I'm a proud Flatlander, and I felt very welcomed here. I also recognize, the privilege that I had in coming to Vermont as a newcomer, with a professional job, having moved from out of state. Took me a while, but I was able to find somewhere to live. Not everybody has that same experience, and it would certainly be easier for folks to find somewhere to live if we simply had more housing, right?
Well, I think that, in general, Vermonters are really willing to accept it and incorporate people who move to Vermont who want to dig into their communities. Because I think that's really the paramount thing. This is just my opinion, obviously.
Sure.
Really the paramount thing, but it's hard to embrace somebody until they're already there.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I will say on the NIMBYism point, because I hear you on the kind of the dark underbelly of that perhaps being xenophobia, right? There is also just I feel a kind of reverence in Vermont for our landscapes and our pastoral, appearance and everything like that. And it's really all lovely and quaint, but also, people need somewhere to live, right? So I think it could be a little bit of both for sure.
One of the things that you might think about is one of the ways to address this is to educate people that new housing doesn't have to be ugly.
True that.
And the way to do that is to take people to look at projects.
Yeah.
And I think AGC could be a partner in that effort.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, some of our members are doing, I was just actually meeting with somebody from Vermont Timber Framers, and he was showing me pictures of one of his latest projects, and it's gorgeous. I mean, it's beautiful, and it's done in a lovely and historic way with wood joists and all of that. And so it looks like it's been there for 100 years, really. And yeah, not every new housing project needs to look like a shipping container, right?
Yeah. So we have about 2 more minutes. We have about 2 more minutes. Do you have, sorry, want to wrap up, or do you have a question? Go ahead.
A quick question. In your assessment, is the design of affordable housing such that it lends itself to a healthy community within, say, that affordable housing project? In other words, I'm thinking back to the projects in Boston and New York, and they have a longstanding reputation for just weren't the way they were built. They got people under a roof, but it was not conducive to help the community. So it's an add-on expense sometimes to create shared space and some of just kind of things that will lend themselves to the growth of how the community is at part of the design considerations. Well, because if it's already $500,000 a unit,
Mhm.
is there an appetite? Is there anybody paying attention to? Are we putting up, and I think this is some of the NIMBYism is Section 8 has, you know, a reputation in neighborhoods with our police departments. How are we avoiding that going forward, but creating the same problems?
Very anecdotally, I would say that our members definitely care about that. And I don't think anyone wants, especially if you think about some of the historic kind of stereotypes of that sort of housing that you're talking about. I mean, so much of that also goes into the issue of redlining and how there's been systemic racism in development and construction for in years prior, for sure, absolutely, especially in some more denser metropolitan areas like you're referring to. I would say that in terms of mandating any sort of, you know, I don't know, for instance, new developments need to have bike paths or something like that. I'm just throwing it out there as an example. That would add perhaps a level of regulatory burden that would just make it more another box to check, right? But in terms of, I mean, like I said, our members are Vermonters in of themselves. I don't think anybody has any interest in, you know, making Vermont strip mall America, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
That
you
all?
very much. Yes. If-
Okay. Great, thank you so much.
I'll tell you what. Why don't we take a 5-minute break?
I love it.
Zero, you are welcome to sit down. We do not have yet enough chairs for more than one. Somebody, you can have someone, you wanna?
I don't need to join that.
Okay. And I don't know, I was raised in Cincinnati and people used to say everybody who'd ever been a colonel was always a colonel.
Oh, Mayor.